Welcome to a deep dive. Today we're plunging into, well, a really fascinating stack of sources about something absolutely fundamental.
Hmm.
How human beings have, built knowledge over millennia, specifically how we've captured, organized, and shared what we learn about the natural world.
Right.
We've got articles here that span from the very beginnings of writing through the painstaking creation of historical illustrations,
Hmm.
the economics of some pretty ambitious publishing ventures, the ingenious methods people devised to manage floods of information.
Yeah, the sheer volume of it all.
Exactly. And even how modern science is helping us understand these historical objects in completely new ways.
It's a truly fascinating collection. It really charts a course across thousands of years of human effort, doesn't it?
It really does.
We'll see how the tools and techniques people used evolved, quite dramatically. From the earliest scratches in clay to these highly sophisticated systems for classifying life
Right.
and making that knowledge accessible, hopefully, to wider audiences. It's really a story of human ingenuity. It's driven by both, intense curiosity about the world around us, but also just the very practical need to document things like what plants can heal you or what animals are out there.
Exactly. Think of this as a journey through the history of, let's say, being informed about nature,
Mm.
powered by that fundamental human urge to understand and categorize.
Mm.
Our mission in this deep dive is to unpack these sources, pull out the most important insights, the surprising facts, and really get at the why behind these historical methods.
Yeah, understanding the context.
We'll explore how the challenges people faced back then in documenting the world, well, how they resonate even today in our own information-saturated lives. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So where do we even begin to understand how people started documenting the natural world? I guess we have to start at the very foundation, the dawn of recording knowledge itself.
Right.
What did people use to write with in those ancient times, and what kind of, absolutely crucial information were they preserving first?
Well, to understand that, we really need to look at the history of writing implements and, crucially, the surfaces they were used on.
Okay.
The very earliest forms of symbolic representation were carvings or maybe pictographs, but structured writing systems, systems capable of recording complex information.
Mm.
They really emerged around 3100 BCE
Wow, that far back. Where was this?
in the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. And it's interesting, this wasn't initially about, say, documenting nature studies.
No. What was it for then?
It was driven by really immediate administrative needs, tracking goods, inventories, complex trade transactions, governmental decrees, that sort of thing.
Practical stuff.
Very practical. And the tools were incredibly simple by our standards, yet utterly revolutionary for their time.
Simple tools for complex tasks. What were they actually using?
Sharpened reed styluses, basically pieces of reed sharpened.
Okay.
And these were used to press wedge-shaped symbols, what we now call cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge,
Right, cuneiform. I've heard of that.
into soft clay tablets. And then these tablets would be sun-dried or sometimes baked in a kiln.
And that made them permanent.
Exactly. Creating a remarkably durable, permanent record. Think about it. Transforming malleable mud into fixed information. That was the bedrock for organized record keeping.
Right.
It was the very possibility of accumulating knowledge beyond what one person or even a group could just remember or pass down orally.
So this allowed civilizations to really scale up their administration and their knowledge base.
Absolutely. It was fundamental.
Okay, so starting with practical, almost bureaucratic needs on clay, what came next? How did materials and tools evolve as civilizations grew?
Well, the ancient Egyptians were major innovators here. They moved to using brushes and reed pens, but crucially, they shifted to papyrus as a surface.
Papyrus, right, made from the plant.
Exactly. Made from the pith of the papyrus plant, processed into these flexible sheets. And this offered enormous advantages over heavy, bulky clay tablets.
I can imagine. Much lighter.
Much lighter. Yeah. You can roll it, stack it, carry it much more easily. This increased mobility and flexibility just changed what was possible. Record keeping, knowledge dissemination, it all became easier.
Okay.
Then, as we move forward to ancient Greece, and particularly the Roman Empire, wax tablets paired with metal styluses became really popular.
Wax tablets, tell me more. Like a reusable notebook.
Exactly like that. They were typically wooden frames filled with a layer of beeswax, sometimes darkened with soot. You'd scratch into the wax with a pointed metal stylus, creating visible indentations.
And reusable how?
The beauty was the other end of the stylus was often flattened, like a little spatula. You could use that end to smooth the wax over, erasing what you'd written, and reuse the tablet again and again.
That's clever.
Super practical. They were durable, reusable, erasable. Ideal for notes, drafts, calculations, administrative tasks, and especially education. And the source highlights their crucial role in the expansive bureaucracy of the Roman Empire. I mean, trying to manage an empire that vast without some form of easily usable, reusable writing surface, it would have been almost impossible.
Yeah, you can really see how the tools and materials adapted directly to the needs of these complex societies.
Definitely. Form follows function.
And it wasn't just about trade and taxes, right? Our sources talk about a truly monumental work from this Roman period that was specifically about documenting the natural world for a very practical human need, medicine.
Ah, yes. You must mean De Materia Medica.
That's the one. Tell us about it.
Right, De Materia Medica. This is really a cornerstone of historical, botanical, and medical knowledge. It's a 5-volume pharmacopoeia.
Pharmacopoeia, so like a drug reference book.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
A comprehensive guide to medicinal substances. It was written by Pedanius Dioscorides. He was a Greek physician, but he was serving in the Roman army.
Interesting combination.
It was. And he compiled this work sometime between 50 and 70 CE.
So, right in the 1st century CE, what exactly did it cover? Was it just plants?
It meticulously detailed medicinal plants primarily, yes.
Yeah.
But it also included some animal products and mineral substances. And crucially, it described the medicines derived from them.
Okay.
The scope was just immense for its time. We're talking around 600 distinct medicinal plants and details on approximately 1,000 different medicines or preparations.
1,000 medicines. That's incredible for that era.
It really is. But what's utterly staggering, and maybe the key insight here, is its longevity. This work wasn't just read for a few decades or even centuries. No. It was widely read, copied, translated, annotated, and considered the prime historical source for the medicines used by Greeks, Romans, and many other cultures across Europe and the Middle East for over 1,500 years.
1,500 years.
1,500 years. It remained essentially the definitive text on the subject until revised herbals started to emerge more widely during the Renaissance. It really only started to be significantly supplanted in the 16th century.
Wow. In an age before printing, before mass communication, for a single text to hold that kind of authority for that long, it's truly mind-boggling. What made it so incredibly enduring?
Well, according to Tess Anna-Spaldiston, who translated and edited a modern version of the text, Dioscorides was regarded as the ultimate authority on plants and medicine, precisely because his writings, quote, addressed the many ills of mankind most usefully.
So it was practical, it worked.
It seems so, yes.
Yeah.
He wasn't just listing plants abstractly. He was providing practical, often effective treatments for real health problems people faced. He described many drugs that were valuable then, and some whose descendants are valuable even now.
Like which ones? What kind of things are we talking about that might ring a bell?
Well, he details substances like aconite, aloes, which we still use, right?
Yeah, in skincare and things.
Right. Bitter apple, colchicum, still used medically today for gout.
Really?
Yes. Henbane, squill.
Yeah.
These were serious medicinal compounds. And as he hinted, some substances he described sounded remarkably familiar. He mentions willow, for instance.
Willow, like the tree.
Exactly. The bark-akin salicylates, which, centuries down the line, ultimately led scientists to synthesize aspirin.
No kidding. So the knowledge was there implicitly.
In a way, yes. He also accurately lists opium, noting its medicinal uses for pain relief and cough suppression, but also clearly stating its narcotic properties. Very precise observation. And then there's a whole range of plants he described that are, believe it or not, still listed in modern pharmacopoeias.
Still.
Maybe not always as primary drugs, but perhaps as minor drugs or diluents or flavoring agents or emollients. Think about this list. Anise, cinnamon, coriander, dill, fennel, ginger, lavender, mustard, myrrh, olive oil, pepper, peppermint, saffron, sesame.
Wow, that sounds like my spice rack.
Exactly. Many of these are still culinary or medicinal mainstays. And the source specifically notes that licorice, which Dioscorides described in detail, is still used by Chinese and Indian physicians today.
That's a direct line of tradition stretching back 2 millennia. Incredible.
It is. And he also provided treatments for very common ailments of his time. Things like drugs for urinary tract infections, palliatives for toothache, suggesting things like colocynth, and treatments for various skin and eye diseases. It was a very practical manual.
It's a real testament to the level of observation and empirical knowledge they had, even back then. But you mentioned it's a product of its time. The sources note a blend of approaches, right? It wasn't all pure science.
Yes, that's an important point to make. While much of the work is clearly based on empirical observation describing what the plant looks like, where it grows, what effect using it actually has the source, does note that a few superstitious practices are also recorded within the materia medica.
Like what?
For instance, he mentions using the plant ichium, often called viper's bugloss, perhaps because of the shape of its seeds, as an amulet to ward off snakes.
Ah, okay. Sympathetic magic, sort of.
Kind of. Or using paulimonia, Jacob's ladder, for scorpion stings. So this inclusion reminds us that even in a foundational, largely empirical text like this, there was still a blending of observed knowledge with existing folklore, beliefs, and perhaps magical thinking about the natural world.
It shows the context, doesn't it? The world in which even this systematic observation was taking place.
Exactly.
So, given its immense importance and the fact that it was relied upon for 1,500 years, how was this crucial knowledge copied and spread across such vast distances and times, especially in an age before printing presses? That must have been a huge challenge.
It was a monumental challenge, and this is where the shift in writing technology becomes critically important again, particularly as we move into the medieval period in Europe.
Okay.
The move to parchment and vellum as the primary writing surface was absolutely key.
Parchment and vellum, those are made from animal skins, right?
Correct. Made from treated animal skins, usually sheep, goat, or calf skin. These materials provided an incredibly durable and long-lasting surface for writing, much more resilient than papyrus, which could become brittle or damaged by moisture over long periods.
Right, so they lasted longer.
Much longer. And that durability was absolutely essential for preserving texts across centuries, especially through the laborious process of manual copying. And the widespread adoption of parchment and vellum went hand in hand with the rise of the quill pen.
Ah, the quill pen. The classic image of the medieval scribe hunched over a manuscript that was central to knowledge preservation, wasn't it?
Utterly central.
Yeah.
For 1,000 years or more, it was the main tool. Quill pens were crafted from the large flight or tail feathers of birds. Typically, geese or swans were preferred.
Why feathers? What made them good for writing?
Unlike the rigid reed styluses or brushes used earlier, the tip of a well-cut quill is flexible. It has a natural springiness. This allowed for much finer, more controlled, and more intricate strokes on the smooth surface of parchment.
More detail possible.
Yes. And combined with inks made from natural sources, iron gall ink was particularly popular.
Iron gall? What's that?
It's derived from oak galls, those little growths on oak trees caused by insects mixed with iron salts, like ferrous sulfate, and a binder like gum arabic. It was incredibly durable, dark, and waterproof once dry, making it ideal for permanent records. Though other inks, like soot-based carbon inks or inks from plant extracts, were also used.
Okay.
So the quill pen became the essential tool for scribes, and much of this meticulous transcription work, as you probably know, took place in monastic communities.
Monks copying books.
Exactly. Monks were often tasked with copying religious texts, of course, but also vital secular and scientific works, including classical texts like De Materia Medica.
So the quill wasn't just a tool, it became almost a symbol of scholarship and the preservation of learning itself.
It certainly did. The ability to read and write proficiently with a quill was a clear mark of literacy and education, skills which, for many centuries, were largely limited to the clergy and the aristocratic elite. These groups were the primary custodians of written knowledge.
And it was hard work, copying.
Immense work. The act of copying a manuscript, especially a large one, was an enormous undertaking. It could take months, sometimes even years, for a single scribe to complete a single large volume.
Wow.
And we see this dedication reflected in that wonderful anecdote from one of our sources, the official botanist monk at Carius on Mount Athos.
What about him?
Remarkably, even in more modern times, he still carried and regularly used 4 large manuscript volumes of Dioscorides that he had copied himself by hand.
He copied all 4 volumes himself.
That's what the source says. I mean, just think about that personal investment, the years of painstaking labor involved in creating those copies. He wasn't just a reader, he was a physical link in that long chain of knowledge transmission across centuries.
That really underscores the value placed on texts like Dioscorides and the incredibly manual, dedicated nature of how knowledge was preserved and disseminated for such a very long time.
Absolutely. Personal, laborious, and essential.
So we've explored the fundamental tools evolving from styluses on clay to quills on vellum used to preserve critical knowledge like the medicinal properties in materia medica, but capturing the look of the natural world, accurately depicting the plants and animals themselves. That adds a whole other dimension beyond just words, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Words can convey details, sure, but a visual representation, an illustration, can immediately show the form, the structure, the coloration, texture, relative size of an organism
Mm.
in a way that pages and pages of text might struggle to achieve concisely.
Right. A picture is worth 1,000 words, as they say.
Well, exactly. And this is where biological illustration comes in. It's a specialized form of scientific illustration focused specifically on living organisms. It became indispensable for identifying species, understanding anatomy, and communicating findings in natural history, especially, in the era before photography changed everything.
And how did naturalists and publishers manage to produce these illustrations alongside the text back then? It seems like it would have been a significant technical hurdle.
It was. Early on, particularly as printing presses with movable type became more common in Europe from the 15th century onwards, woodcuts were the key technique for integrating images and text.
Woodcuts, how did those work?
It's a relief printing process. You take a block of wood, usually something fine-grained like pear wood, and you carve the image into it. You cut away the parts you don't want to print, leaving the lines and areas that will hold the ink raised.
Okay, so the image stands out from the block.
Precisely. And because it's a relief process, just like the metal type used for letters, the wood block could be made the same height as the type.
Ah, so you could put them together.
Exactly. This was the revolutionary part. It meant illustrations could be locked into the page layout right alongside the text and printed simultaneously on a standard printing press. This made producing illustrated natural history books much more feasible and affordable than previous methods, and it greatly facilitated the exchange of scientific ideas among scholars across different regions. However, while woodcuts were efficient, they could be somewhat crude, especially for capturing the really fine details needed for accurate scientific illustration of, say, complex botanical structures or intricate animal anatomy.
Right, wood isn't the easiest material for super fine lines.
Exactly. So, to achieve greater precision, naturalists and artists increasingly turned to intaglio printing techniques, especially from the 16th and 17th centuries onwards.
Intaglio, you mentioned that's the opposite of relief.
That's right. In intaglio, the image is incised or cut into a metal plate, not raised above it. Usually the plate was copper initially, which is relatively soft and easy to work. Later, steel became more common.
How did they cut into the metal?
Two main ways: engraving, where you use a sharp tool called a burin to cut lines directly into the metal plate by hand, or etching, where you first cover the plate with a wax or acid-resistant ground, then you scratch your design through that ground with a needle, exposing the metal underneath. Then you immerse the plate in acid, which bites or etches the lines into the exposed metal.
Okay, so engraving is direct cutting, etching uses acid.
Correct. And both processes allow for much finer lines, greater density of detail, cross-hatching for shading, and a wider range of tonal values compared to woodcuts. This made them ideal for intricate biological drawings demanding scientific accuracy.
So much better detail with intaglio. But what were the trade-offs? You mentioned challenges.
The main technical challenge was printing them. Because the ink sits down in the incised lines, not on a raised surface, intaglio plates require much higher pressure during printing to force the damp paper into the grooves and lift the ink out.
Right, got to squeeze the ink onto the paper.
Exactly. And this meant they couldn't typically be printed on the same press as the letterpress text, which uses much less pressure. So the illustrations had to be printed separately, usually on a different type of press called a rolling press.
Ah, okay, so two printing processes needed for one book page.
Well, not for one page, but for the book as a whole. You'd print the text pages on a letterpress, print the illustration pages on a rolling press, and then the binder would have to collate them correctly, interleaving the illustration sheets into the book alongside the relevant text pages.
That sounds way more complex and costly.
It was. Definitely more labor-intensive and expensive. But the superior detail was often considered worth it for high-quality scientific works where accuracy was paramount.
And you mentioned steel plates came later.
Yes, the introduction of steel plates, particularly in late 18th and early 19th centuries, was significant. Steel is much harder than copper. While harder to engrave initially, a steel plate could withstand many more impressions without wearing down.
So you could print more copies from one plate.
Significantly more, maybe thousands of sharp impressions from a steel plate, compared to perhaps only hundreds from a copper plate before the line started to degrade. This was crucial for larger publishing ventures aiming at wider audiences, making detailed illustrations more economically viable for longer print runs.
Right. That makes sense for something like the Naturalist library we'll talk about. But even with these incredibly detailed prints from copper or steel, you still just had black and white lines, right? As you said, nature isn't monochrome. How did they add the color?
Color. That's another huge part of the story. For centuries, the primary method for adding color to these printed natural history illustrations was painstaking hand coloring.
Hand coloring. You mean someone literally sat there with watercolors and painted over the black and white print?
That's exactly what it means. Skilled colorists would apply watercolor washes and sometimes opaque colors like gouache over the monochrome prints produced from the woodcuts or intaglio plates.
For every single print and every single copy of a book, that sounds like an absolutely immense amount of labor. Mind-boggling.
It was an enormous undertaking, and it's a key insight into the economics and production methods of the time. It was incredibly time-consuming, required skill and consistency, and, as you might expect, often led to considerable variations between different copies of the same book.
I bet, depending on who painted it or even what day it was.
Exactly. The skill of the individual colorist, their speed, the specific batch of paints they were using, the lighting conditions, all could affect the final result. There were efforts to standardize it, like providing master plates or pattern sheets, but hand coloring remained dominant for high-quality natural history illustrations well into the 19th century, even after some color printing techniques emerged. There were experiments with early color printing techniques, though, like the à la poupée technique you sometimes see mentioned.
À la poupée. What's that?
It means with the doll in French. Basically, different ink colors were carefully dabbed onto different parts of the same engraved plate using little pads or tampons of cloth called poupées or dolls before printing. So you could, say, ink the leaves green and the flower red on the plate itself.
Ah, okay. Printing multiple colors at once from one plate.
Sort of. It could lay down base colors or specific colored details in one go. Sometimes this was used on its own, but often it was combined with additional hand coloring afterwards to add finer details, shading, or washes. Didn't necessarily save time, but it could help with consistency.
So was this early color printing just about saving time or money then?
Not always, interestingly. The source brings up Alexander Wilson's American Ornithology from the early 19th century. That's considered the first really comprehensive illustrated work on North American birds.
Okay.
Wilson used a hybrid approach. He had hand-colored engravings, but he also incorporated some of these early color printing techniques. And the source notes he wasn't doing this primarily to save money. In fact, the hybrid method was sometimes more expensive than just straightforward hand coloring or leaving them monochrome.
So why do it?
His stated goal was achieving a faithful imitation of nature. He felt that reducing the potential variation between copies, which pure hand coloring inevitably introduced by using some printed color, actually improved the overall scientific accuracy and consistency of the depiction. That was vital for a work intended for identifying birds.
That makes sense. Consistency for science.
Exactly. And he famously struggled with the sheer labor of it. He even relied on his daughters and the female relatives of friends to help with the laborious hand coloring when he ran short on funds for professional colorists.
So who were these colorists typically, especially as demand grew? Was it still just artists and authors' families pitching in?
Initially, yes, that kind of artisanal or family-based coloring was common, like with Wilson. But as the demand for illustrated books, particularly natural history, just exploded in the 18th and especially the 19th century, and print runs increased dramatically, hand coloring evolved into a much larger scale operation. It became a kind of cottage industry first. Printers or publishers would send out stacks of the printed black and white sheets to specialized families or small workshops who did the coloring work in their own homes.
Right. Outsourcing the coloring.
Exactly. And these operations frequently employed women and children. There are accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries of children being used for coloring simpler woodcuts, or maybe doing the broader washes on more complex prints like acquaintance, with adults doing the finer details. But later, especially for really large, high-profile projects requiring more control over quality and speed, the process transitioned again. It moved into dedicated coloring establishments within the printing firms themselves.
A coloring establishment. That sounds fascinating. Almost like a factory floor, but dedicated to art.
In a way, yes. It was a method to manage the mass production of colored prints more efficiently and consistently. These establishments could employ large numbers of colorists working together.
How many people are we talking?
The source notes that Robert Havell Jr., who famously engraved and colored Audubon's monumental The Birds of America, employed up to 50 colorists working under one roof at the peak of that project. 50 people just painting birds.
50? Wow. How did they keep it consistent?
They'd usually have a superintendent or foreman who would oversee the teams, distribute the work. Maybe one person did all the blue feathers, another the yellow assembly line style, and try to maintain consistency against a master pattern plate. And there's an interesting glimpse into the social aspect, too. An article mentioned in the sources discussing female colorists in New York, but likely reflecting similar trends in Britain at the time, describes them.
What does it say?
It suggests they were often teenage girls, some perhaps with a basic education. Interestingly, it notes they weren't always from families who strictly needed the income, but maybe young women who enjoyed having their own money. And it intriguingly mentions their supposed fondness for showy dresses.
A bit judgmental, maybe.
Perhaps a societal stereotype of the time, yes. But it gives us a tiny glimpse into the social context and perceptions surrounding this labor. It was seen perhaps as respectable, semi-skilled work, appealing to young women seeking some independent income, but maybe not always viewed with the same gravitas as other professions, even though the work itself, especially for detailed scientific plates, required considerable care, dexterity, and skill.
It's really striking how the technical challenges of printing, the economics of publishing, the sheer scale of labor required, and even these little glimpses into the social dynamics and perceptions of the workers, they're all woven together in the history of these illustrated books.
Absolutely. You can't separate the final product from the process and people involved.
And the illustrations themselves were clearly absolutely central to the success and appeal of projects like the Naturalist Library, which is one of our key sources here.
They were indeed. The Naturalist Library, published in Edinburgh by William Home Lizars and Sir William Jardine between 1833 and 1843, is a really fascinating case study in popularizing natural history.
40 volumes, you said? That's huge.
40 volumes, yes. Each volume costing 6 shillings, which was relatively affordable compared to luxury productions like Audubon's. And each one contained over 35 hand-colored steel engravings. Their stated goal was ambitious, to make information about the great works of creation accessible to all classes.
6 shillings? It sounds affordable now, but was it really for all classes back then?
Well, the source points out that while it was certainly much, much cheaper than the ultra-luxury subscription works like Audubon's Birds of America, which cost a fortune, 6 shillings was still a significant amount of money in the 1830s and 40s.
How significant?
It was almost an entire day's wages for a skilled tradesman at the time. So while it definitely broadened the audience considerably beyond just the wealthy landed gentry or aristocracy who could afford the truly lavish books, it was realistically aimed more at the growing middle-class professionals, merchants, educated artisans, probably not the working-class poor, who might perhaps only afford much cheaper penny periodicals. Books, even these more affordable ones, remained a minor luxury, as the source puts it. But Lizars and Jardine absolutely believed the illustrations were a key part of its broad appeal. They noted explicitly that anyone unacquainted with zoology can obtain pleasure and profit from glancing at illustrations alone.
So the pictures drew people in even if they didn't read all the text.
Exactly. And they emphasized the accuracy, noting the illustrations weren't always drawn from original specimens, but were carefully selected from the most approved sources to ensure faithfulness.
And the coloring for this massive 40-volume project, did they use that establishment model you mentioned?
They did. And we know this because Lizars himself wrote about it. He explicitly described needing to organize a school of females to do the coloring work on his own premises after his previous network of outworkers or cottage industry colorists apparently went on strike or caused problems.
Ah, so he brought the work in-house for control.
Yes, it marked a definite shift away from the older cottage industry model, at least for a project of this scale and ambition. He even framed it quite positively, suggesting it provided agreeable, permanent, and profitable employment for industrious persons, particularly women, who might be precluded from other occupations.
Interesting framing. So the illustrations were clearly integral, driving the production methods and economics.
Absolutely central. The fact that, as the source mentions, they later reissued collections just of the plates from the Naturalist Library and other books really underscores how vital the visuals were to the whole enterprise's identity and market appeal. People wanted the pictures.
So we've charted this incredible progression from ancient texts capturing knowledge like medicinal properties, transcribed by hand with quills, to these beautifully illustrated natural history books produced on a much larger scale using woodcuts, intricate engravings, and armies of hand colorists. But as exploration expanded and printing techniques allowed for more books, the sheer volume of information must have become overwhelming. All these new species being discovered and described during the 17th, 18th centuries. That must have been a massive challenge for naturalists trying to compile comprehensive works. How did anyone possibly keep track of it all?
You've absolutely hit on the critical bottleneck of that era. The period roughly from the 17th century onwards saw this explosion of new discoveries. Global exploration, collecting expeditions, improved microscopy, increased scientific communication through journals and letters.
A flood of data.
A veritable flood. Naturalists were suddenly bombarded with specimens, descriptions, drawings, reports from literally all corners of the known globe. And this led to what some historians of science have termed the first bioinformation crisis.
The first bioinformation crisis. I like that term.
It fits, doesn't it? The fundamental challenge shifted. It wasn't just about describing nature anymore. It was about managing the overwhelming amount of incoming information about it. How do you keep track of everything? How do you integrate new findings consistently? And crucially, how do you organize it all into a coherent, functional system that you and others can actually use and build upon?
Right. It's useless if you can't find anything or see the connections.
Precisely.
And this is where Carl Linnaeus steps onto the stage, right? A name that is practically synonymous with bringing order to the natural world.
Absolutely. Carl Linnaeus, or Carl von Linné, after he was ennobled, the Swedish botanist, physician, and zoologist who lived from 1707 to 1778. He was a pivotal figure in confronting this information crisis head-on.
And our sources give us a look into how he actually worked.
Yes, they give us a fascinating, almost intimate glimpse into his personal fact-gathering strategies and his day-to-day working routines. It reveals a mind constantly grappling, experimenting, innovating with how to manage and organize these vast amounts of biological data. And at the core of his challenge was this fundamental tension you identified.
The order versus the flood.
Exactly. He needed to bring this chaotic flood of factual information into a fixed, structured, retrievable order, the kind of systematic classification, the binomial nomenclature that he's famous for. But at the same time, the flow of new discoveries was incessant. His system had to be flexible enough to constantly integrate that new information without having to tear everything down and start from scratch every time a new plant arrived from the Cape of Good Hope.
So order versus flexibility, a tension we still feel today with digital information, maybe.
Very much so. It's a perennial problem in knowledge management. How did writing itself help him bridge this gap?
How did he use writing?
Well, writing, as the anthropologist Jack Goody pointed out in one of the sources, functions intrinsically as a locational sorting device.
A locational sorting device. What does that mean?
It means writing creates an abstract, visual, two-dimensional space on the page where you can arrange information. You can put things in lists, tables, diagrams, or other systematic formats. You can abstract the information from its original context, like a physical plant specimen or a collector's messy field notes, and place it into an ordered structure.
So you can compare and organize things visually on the page?
Precisely. And it's probably no coincidence that lists, simple ordered lists, dominate the very earliest forms of writing we find across many cultures. They're a fundamental way to impose order on disparate items. Linnaeus intuitively, and then very deliberately, used the technology of writing in this way.
But how did he apply this locational sorting idea to the absolutely massive task of trying to organize all known plants and animals of his time? That seems like more than just making lists.
It was much more. And one key strategy, which seems quite modern in retrospect, was his publishing approach. Instead of trying to create one single, static, definitive masterpiece that would instantly be outdated by the next shipment of specimens.
Which would be impossible anyway.
Totally impossible.
Yeah.
Instead, Linnaeus adopted a dynamic publishing strategy. He published his major classification systems, Genera Plantarum, Systema Naturae, in a series of continually revised and expanded editions throughout his career.
Like software versioning, version 1.0, 2.0, etc.
Exactly like that. His Genera Plantarum, which organized plants by genus, went through 7 authorized editions during his lifetime. It started with 935 genera in the first edition of 1737 and grew to 1343 genera by the 6th edition in 1764.
Wow.
And his most famous work, Systema Naturae, which aimed to classify all three kingdoms of nature minerals, plants, and animals, had an even more dramatic trajectory. It started incredibly modestly as just an 11-page folio pamphlet in 1735. By the time of the 12th edition, published between 1766 and 1768, it had swelled into three massive octavo volumes, totaling around 2,500 pages.
That's an incredible expansion. It sounds like he treated his publications almost like a living database, constantly being updated.
That's a perfect way to put it. This strategy of serial updates allowed him to systematically integrate new information as it arrived from his vast network of correspondents and collectors all over the world. Each new edition wasn't just a reprint, it was a revised, corrected, and expanded version, incorporating the latest discoveries and refinements to his system.
So each edition was like a fixed snapshot, but also a foundation for the next one?
Precisely. It effectively used each published edition as a stable, fixed snapshot of his system at that point in time, providing a reference for the scientific community, while simultaneously serving as a working draft or stepping stone for the next revision. And let's not forget the practical side.
Yep.
This approach also provided him with a steady income stream through repeated sales of new editions, which helped fund his ongoing research, collections, and publication efforts. It was scientifically and economically astute.
That's a smart publishing model, as you say, quite modern in its concept of iterative updates and continuous improvement. But before the information made it into those printed editions, how did he handle the raw flow of notes, specimen descriptions, letters from collectors in his personal working space? How did he manage the data before publication?
This is where the sources reveal his truly ingenious, sometimes quite quirky manuscript methods. His unpublished papers show a real evolution in his thinking about information management.
Like what? What did he do early on?
Well, early on, with projects like his Manuscripta Medica from 1727-1730, compiled while he was still a medical student, he would create these small, handmade fascicles.
Fascicles, little bundles.
Essentially, yes, little bound notebooks he made himself. And in these, he meticulously copied excerpts, summaries, and lists from the medical books he was reading. But he structured them very formally, with title pages, distinct sections for main text summaries, and neat tabular lists of genera and species. He even added little analytical drawings in the margins. It shows this early, inherent drive to impose order and structure on information gathered from multiple sources.
Already thinking systematically.
Very much so. Then, for his most ambitious project, the compilation of his universal plant catalog, Species Plantarum, the book that established binomial nomenclature for plants, published in 1753, he worked on it for 20 years.
20 years?
Yes. And for the drafts that eventually went to the printer, he used bound notebooks. But within these notebooks, he developed a really unique, almost physical system for organizing the thousands of species under their respective genera.
What was the system?
Sometimes, when he was adding the list of species for a particular genus, instead of just continuing linearly down the page and potentially running on to the next page, separating it from the genus heading, he would do something different. He might flip the page over and write the species list on the back, or even turn the entire notebook upside down and write the list working from the bottom of the page upwards towards the genus name.
Wait, turn the book upside down? Why on earth would he do that? That sounds incredibly awkward.
It sounds bizarre to us, right? We're so used to linear text. But the source interprets this method quite cleverly. It describes the series of species as folding onto itself within the conceptual box of the genus.
Folding onto itself.
Yeah. By writing upwards towards the genus name, or on the back of the page belonging to that genus, he was using the physical two-dimensional space of the notebook page in a nonlinear way. He was creating a kind of virtual depth on the flat paper surface, trying to keep all the information related to one genus physically clustered together. It made the genus boxes, or sections, feel more cohesive, and allowed him to insert new species descriptions more easily later without completely disrupting the sequence of genera in the notebook. We can actually see this in the images from his Species Plantarum manuscripts from 1746 and 1748 that are provided in the sources. It's truly fascinating to see this method in action. It's an incredible physical workaround, almost a hack, for achieving database-like organization on paper, long before relational databases or even simple filing cabinets were a thing.
That is remarkably inventive, using the physical page structure to represent logical structure.
It absolutely is. And the sources reveal something potentially even more significant about his Species Plantarum drafts. The very earliest draft manuscript, dating from 1746, was compiled not in bound notebooks at all, but apparently on loose sheets of paper.
Loose sheets, like slips of paper.
Exactly. This is a crucial detail that scholars have uncovered. It suggests that his initial process for organizing the thousands upon thousands of plant species he was dealing with was based on a much more flexible modular system of mobile sheets.
Why is that significant?
Because it would have allowed him to shuffle, rearrange, insert, add, or remove entries for species or even whole genera much more easily before committing them to the more fixed, linear format of the bound manuscript that eventually went to the printer. It points to an earlier phase of using a physically manipulable system. And then, late in his life, in the mid-1760s, he appears to have fully embraced and perhaps formalized the potential of these separate mobile units of information. The sources show images of actual paper slips he used in preparing the later, greatly expanded editions of Systema Naturae.
Paper slips, what did they look like?
They look remarkably like modern index cards. Small slips of paper, each containing information about an individual species or perhaps a genus, the name, diagnostic features, references, habitat notes.
So he basically invented the index card.
That is precisely what the sources strongly suggest. It seems this became his ultimate solution for tackling that core tension we talked about, balancing the need for a fixed, systematic order for his public knowledge with the constant, practical need to easily accommodate, insert, update, and rearrange the relentless flow of new information coming in from his global network of correspondents and collectors.
Wow. Necessity really is the mother of invention. He needed a tool to manage the world's biological information, so he effectively created it.
It appears so. And the key insight the source emphasizes here is that what seems like such a simple, obvious tool to us today, the humble index card, the filing system wasn't just an immediate, obvious invention. It was something that had to be figured out, developed, learned through an incessant, painstaking process of experimentation, fact-gathering, and reorganization, as the source beautifully describes Linnaeus' intellectual journey.
Right. It wasn't obvious then.
Not at all. His progression through these different manuscript methods, from annotations and handmade fascicules to his quirky page folding in bound notebooks, his likely experimentation with loose sheets, and finally culminating in the paper slip index card system, it shows this continuous struggle and innovation and the practicalities of information management. It highlights that constant interplay between the desire to bring information into a fixed, stable, publishable order, like a printed book or a neatly bound manuscript, and the simultaneous need to keep that information mobile, flexible, and updatable through annotations, interleaved pages, loose sheets, and eventually these index card-like slips.
And these methods weren't just for his own personal efficiency, were they? They fed back into the larger scientific project.
Exactly. His highly structured publications, which were based on these meticulously organized drafts, were what facilitated the collective enterprise of 18th century natural history. His binomial nomenclature system and his hierarchical classifications provided a common language and a widely accepted framework that other naturalists all over the world could adopt and use.
So they could slot their discoveries into his system.
Precisely. They could identify where their newly discovered plant from Siberia or insect from Suriname fit into his system. They could use his naming conventions. They could contribute their findings back to him, often sending specimens or detailed descriptions. And this new knowledge would then flow back into Linnaeus' central processing unit, allowing him to update and expand his system in the next edition. His centralizing impetus, as the source calls it, drew knowledge from these vast global networks into his continuously refined, organized system, built on these innovative paper technologies.
It really makes you pause and think about our own relationship with information today, doesn't it? Whether it's, digital files scattered across our computers, notes squirreled away in sophisticated apps like Evernote or Notion, or even physical filing systems. We're still grappling with that same core problem Linnaeus faced. How do we effectively capture, organize, retrieve, and integrate information in a world where new facts, new data, new discoveries are constantly emerging, and the sheer volume feels overwhelming? We just have different tools, maybe faster tools, but the fundamental challenge seems quite similar.
It does. The scale is different, but the cognitive task remains.
So we've traced this incredible history of knowledge capture, from ancient scripts and medicinal texts meticulously copied by hand with quills, to beautifully illustrated natural history books produced using engraving and hand coloring, and how brilliant minds like Linnaeus devised ingenious systems, including proto-index cards, to organize that explosion of biological information. Now, fast forward to the 21st century. How do we today study these precious historical artifacts, these ancient manuscripts, the hand-colored illustrations, the early printed books, maybe even Linnaeus' own notes and paper slips? How do we learn even more about the past, not just from the text and images they contain, but from the very physical objects themselves?
This is where modern science gives us some incredibly powerful and often wonderfully non-destructive tools to delve into the material history of these objects. We can analyze the very stuff they're made of.
Okay, like what kind of tools?
One particularly valuable technique highlighted in our sources is Raman spectroscopy.
Raman spectroscopy. That sounds complex. What is it?
It's a technique borrowed from chemistry and physics, but it's proving invaluable for analyzing historical artifacts, particularly for identifying the materials used, like the specific pigments in manuscripts, paintings, and illustrations, or the composition of inks.
How does it work? In simple terms, can you explain it without getting too technical?
I'll try. Essentially, it works by shining a highly focused laser beam, just a tiny point of light, onto the surface of the object you want to analyze, say, a spot of blue paint on an old illustration.
Okay, a laser beam.
Right. When the light from the laser interacts with the molecules in that paint pigment, it causes them to vibrate in specific characteristic ways. Think of it like ringing a bell. Different bells have different tones.
Okay.
Now, most of the laser light simply bounces off or scatters back at the exact same wavelength, the same color as the incoming laser light. That's not very informative. But a tiny, tiny fraction of that light gets scattered back at slightly different wavelengths. It's either gained or lost a tiny bit of energy because it interacted with those specific molecular vibrations in the pigment.
Ah, so the light changes slightly based on the material.
Exactly. This phenomenon is called the Raman effect. The scattered light containing these wavelength shifts is collected and detected. And the pattern of these shifts, how much the wavelength changed and how much light there is at each shifted wavelength, creates a unique spectrum, like a vibrational fingerprint for each different chemical compound or material.
A chemical fingerprint from light scattering. Got it. And why is this particularly useful for historical objects? They're often fragile.
The absolute key advantage is that it's a non-destructive technique. You don't need to scrape off a tiny sample of paint or ink from the precious historical artifact, which conservators are obviously very reluctant to do.
Right, no damage.
You can simply point the laser probe at the area of interest, collect the scattered light, and it gives you the chemical composition of the pigments, inks, or sometimes even the paper fibers or binding media present right there on the surface without leaving a mark.
That's brilliant. So what kind of insights can identifying a specific pigment give us? What stories can the colors themselves tell?
Oh, it can tell us a surprising amount about the history, creation, and context of the object. For example, identifying the specific pigments used can help confirm or refine the dating of an artwork or manuscript.
Oh, so?
Because certain pigments were only available or commonly used during particular time periods or in specific geographical regions. For instance, Prussian blue was invented in the early 18th century, so finding it definitively rules out an earlier date. Conversely, finding pigments like lead tin yellow suggests a date before the early 18th century when it largely fell out of use.
Okay, so it helps date things. What else?
It definitely aids in establishing authenticity. If you find a pigment like, say, titanium white, which wasn't commercially available as an artist pigment until the 1920s, turning up in a painting supposedly from the 16th century, well, you know there's a problem. Either it's a fake or it's been heavily restored later.
Right, flags inconsistencies.
Exactly. It also helps conservators enormously. By knowing exactly what materials they're working with, which specific blue is that? Is it stable? How might it react to cleaning solvents? They can develop much more appropriate and effective conservation and restoration treatments. It also helps them understand how the artwork or manuscript might be degrading over time and why. And from a broader historical perspective, identifying pigments can even shed light on ancient or historical trade routes.
Trade routes. How can a color tell you about trade?
Well, many historical pigments were derived from specific mineral sources that are only found in certain parts of the world. The classic example is ultramarine blue, made from the semi-precious stone lapis lazuli.
Right, lapis. Very expensive.
Historically, incredibly expensive, often worth more than gold. Its primary source for centuries was in a specific region of what is now Afghanistan. So finding genuine ultramarine used in a medieval manuscript in Ireland or a Renaissance painting in Italy tells you a huge amount about the existence and reach of long-distance trade networks that could bring this precious material across continents.
Wow. So the very composition of the colors can trace these global connections across history.
Absolutely. The materials themselves embody these historical connections. The source mentions various pigments that have been identified using Raman spectroscopy in different artifacts, including not just historical ones, but also modern synthetic organic pigments that came into use relatively recently.
Like what modern ones?
Things like phthalocyanine blues and greens, which became common mid-20th century, or toluidine red, and even fluorescent pigments like rhodamine 6G. The ability to identify these specific synthetic and fluorescent pigments is particularly interesting for studying modern and contemporary art, say from the 1950s or 60s onwards, as artists started experimenting with these novel, often much brighter, sometimes even UV-reactive colors produced by the chemical industry. The source gives a specific case study, analyzing paintings by the Italian pop artist Silvio Pasotti. Researchers used Raman spectroscopy alongside other complementary techniques like FTIR, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy, and spectrophlorimetry to build a detailed portfolio of the specific synthetic, organic, and fluorescent pigments he incorporated into his vibrant works.
So it helps art historians understand the technical practices of even relatively recent artists and the evolution of the actual materials available to them.
Precisely. It documents the artist's palette at a chemical level.
This technique feels like such a perfect modern link back to our earlier discussion about those illustrated natural history books and the ancient manuscripts.
It really does bridge the gap.
We can now use tools like Raman spectroscopy to study the very physical materials that make up those hand-colored plates in the Naturalist library, or the inks used in those centuries-old copies of Dioscorides, or the pigments in Audubon's birds. We can potentially understand the specific materials the colorists and scribes were working with at a chemical level, understand the techniques they might have used based on those materials, and maybe even learn more about where those materials came from, connecting back to those trade routes. It adds a whole new layer, doesn't it, to our understanding of how these historical records of the natural world were actually created and passed down. Yeah.
It absolutely does. It allows us to appreciate the material history of the object itself, not just the information it contains. It connects the history of science and natural history directly to the history of materials, technology, and craft. We can appreciate the choices, the resources available, the technical processes involved in their creation, from the simplest reeds and locally sourced earth pigments of antiquity to the complex synthetic pigments and precision-engineered steel plates of the 19th century.
Wow. What an incredible deep dive we've taken today, really charting a course through millennia of human effort to capture, organize, and share knowledge, specifically about the natural world.
It's quite a journey.
From pressing wedge-shaped symbols into clay tablets for, basically administrative purposes, through the painstaking hand copying of crucial medicinal texts like De Materia Medica using quills on durable parchment, to the development of elaborate hand-colored illustrations produced on a much larger scale using printing techniques like engraving for works like the Naturalist's library.
Right, involving whole teams of people.
And then seeing how brilliant minds like Linnaeus devised truly innovative systems, including what really look like proto-index cards, just to manage that explosion of new biological discoveries.
Tackling that information crisis.
All the way up to using cutting-edge modern science like Raman spectroscopy today to uncover the material secrets held within these historical artifacts themselves. It's really quite a suite.
It is crystal clear from these sources, isn't it, that the fundamental human drive to observe, understand, and document the world around us, particularly its incredible biological diversity, has been a powerful engine for innovation throughout history.
Definitely.
People have constantly devised new tools, new techniques, new systems to meet the ever-growing challenges posed by the expansion of knowledge. How do you record it accurately, store it reliably, organize it logically, share it widely? These questions have driven progress.
And we've seen that recurring tension throughout the history we've explored today.
Yeah, tension between order and flux.
Exactly. The desire to fix information in a stable, ordered format, like the bound volumes of Dioscorides' work that lasted 1,500 years, or Linnaeus's neatly printed editions battling against the constant need for flexibility. The need to incorporate new discoveries, allow for rearrangement, as we saw so clearly with Linnaeus's experiments with loose sheets and those index cards. It really does make you reflect on our own time, doesn't it? We're navigating an unprecedented, truly exponential flood of digital information today. I mean, orders of magnitude more than Dioscorides or even Linnaeus could ever have possibly conceived.
Unimaginable amounts.
We have incredibly powerful digital tools for capturing, organizing, searching, sharing data globally, instantaneously.
Mhm.
But are we, at a fundamental level, still wrestling with the same core challenges they faced?
It's a great question.
How do we manage the overload? How do we ensure accuracy and quality? How do we distinguish the noise from the signal? And how do we make essential knowledge truly accessible, discoverable, and retrievable in a meaningful way amidst this digital deluge?
It's a profoundly compelling parallel, I think. The bioinformation crisis that Linnaeus tackled with his paper slips might seem small in scale compared to the digital data tsunami we experience every single day. But the underlying problem, how do you structure chaos? How do you make knowledge usable and keep systems updated in the face of relentless new information that remains strikingly similar?
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? Looking centuries into the future, how will future historians or scientists or just curious people study our records, our vast digital archives, our shared databases on the cloud, the immense volume of information documented and exchanged across our digital networks every second?
What techniques will they use?
Exactly. What techniques will they use to analyze the material substrate of our knowledge? Which won't be ink, paper, or vellum, but maybe server farms, degrading hard drives, obsolete file formats, data packets lost in the ether. What will they analyze to understand how we, in the early 21st century, tried to capture, organize, and share the world as we saw it? It's a bit mind-bending to think about.
That raises a really important question indeed. As you've listened to this deep dive today, thinking about this long history of recording knowledge about the natural world, from ancient reeds in clay all the way to modern lasers, and contemplating our own digital legacy, what single insight or observation stands out to you the most from all of this? Something for all of us, perhaps, to mull over until our next deep dive.